All right, welcome back to the second on the series of lectures on Congress. We have already, if you listen to lecture one, gone over sort of public perceptions of Congress and lack of trust in Congress. And now I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the formal powers and some of the responsibilities of Congress so we can get a better idea of what they actually do, or at least start that process. So this video will cover the formal powers of Congress and our sort of the main responsibilities of Congress. Just to rehash, we've gone through some of this, but just to remind you that what the founders' intentions were around Congress and the legislative body. Remember that they saw the legislative body, Congress itself, both houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives, as being the most important institution in government because in a democracy, in a representative republic, Congress is the most democratic and therefore the most important. It is the direct voice of the people, at least under the founders' model, the way we think about it. Along with that goes the fact that there is also tremendous power in Congress. That is, it poses in many ways, at least to the founders' idea, that it is the biggest threat, perhaps, to democracy and to the rights of the minorities, and so therefore deserves special kinds of attention. What we were looking for, so one of their main goals, of course, was not to have concentration of power in a single institution. We don't want the president to be able to amass all the power, or the courts to amass all their power, or Congress, which is the biggest threat, to amass all their power. So in order to do this, Madison, of course, in the Federalist Papers, in Federalist 51, if you can remember, says that to provide an additional protection, they divide the House of Representatives into two sort of subunits, the Senate and the House of Representatives, and therefore provide an extra check within the institution itself. That is, the Senate and the House of Representatives don't really get along. They come from different constituencies, they have different motivations, they have different powers along the way. That's at least the ideological explanation of the founders. As we can see here in number 2, one of the big reasons for this, of course, from just a practical political standpoint, was that there was a conflict between big states and small states, and so when devising the legislature, the solution became to create two houses in the legislature, one which favors small states, and that's the House of Representatives, that's the Senate, and one that would more likely favor large states, which is the House of Representatives. The Senate favors small states because all states have equal votes. They each get 2 votes. So Rhode Island has as many votes and therefore as much voting power as, say, New York or Florida, Texas, California. And the House of Representatives by proportion. So a place like California, which will have, I think it's around 55 now or 56 votes in the House of Representatives, will have more power than a place like Alaska, which will only have 1 vote in the House of Representatives. So this was the compromise that was struck, or what we call bicameralism along the way. We also intended, at least the founders intended, that each branch would have a different nature because of the way they were selected. The Senate is selected by everybody in a state, the House by members of their district, and therefore we would have a different types of what they would refer to as sort of nature to them. The House of Representatives would be a much more passionate body, the most democratic, directly elected by small constituencies, and therefore and re-elected every 2 years. So very often, this would make them a much more passionate institution. The Senate's elected every 6 years, so they have lots of times to think about things. They come from a very large constituency, which that is the Senate. I mean, their entire state, and therefore makes them more moderate. It's a smaller body. It only has 100 people. The House of Representatives has 435 people. And so there's this idea, and it still plays out today, that the Senate is more contemplative and slower and conservative to act, where the House is more passionate and hyperbolic and tumultuous and more quickly to act. And that, for the most part, still plays out today. There's some changes that undermines that, the main one being the fact that senators are now directly elected as opposed to selected by state legislators. We expected Congress, through all this interaction, this conflict, and the need for compromise, to be slow and deliberative in what they do. And we expect them to have this sort of representative connection. That is, they should be looking to do the this one here, representative connection. We expect them to be doing the will of the people along the way. Now we get to the formal powers of Congress. That is, what is in the details of the Constitution, what is laid out explicitly. Of course, the formal powers of Congress are spelled out in Article 1, in particular Section 8 of the Constitution, and they do a variety of things, some of which we've already discussed. They get to collect taxes, they get to regulate commerce and interactions between the states, and obviously their Congress gets to lead in terms of foreign commerce, that is, in terms of building treaties or regulating trade between the United States and other countries. As we know, they get to declare war, even though they don't get to run the war, and they have a variety of other kinds of activities, which if you go to Article 1, Section 8, you can read them. They're all along the ways. The big one, as again we've discussed, but just to reiterate, is what we call the necessary and proper clause, which is make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. That is, the foregoing powers that are listed in Article 1, Section 8. And so that sort of fills in the gap, and Congress, even to this day, uses the necessary and proper clause to justify many of its actions along the way. It is interesting that Congress, because of all these very specific powers and the way we've set up our government, is actually an organization, a congressional legislative body that can actually govern, that can actually make decisions for government to do things. Many legislatures don't have that sort of exclusive power ability to do that. There are other kind of formal powers. They have we sort of categorize these formal powers in Article 1, Section 8. We can categorize into 4 areas. One is financial, where we've already talked a little bit about that. Second is legal, in terms of establishing citizenship and enacting laws, regulating money, things like that. Third is institutional. That is, they have some ability to form institutions. They can write laws that form executive agencies like Department of Homeland Security. They run Washington, D.C. They admit new states, etc. And then, of course, in defense, they get to regulate laws around prisoners of war, declare war, and, of course, finance the military, which is one of their major powers. So we can think of these, and you should think about these in these 4 areas: financial, legal, institutional, and defense. You should remember those 4 areas of Congress along the way. Finally, we can think about Congress in terms of its function. And we're going to look over the next lectures at several functions of Congress, namely representation, right? Second, lawmaking, and third, oversight. These are all major aspects, and what we're going to see is that each one of these 3 activities, or these functions that they go in, correspond with certain kinds of powers and actions that members of Congress take. We're going to see a correlation between these things. Of course, representation talks about the fact that that is where we make a connection between legislators and citizens. So that's what we call the nerve ending along the way. Lawmaking is actually developing policy, taking preferences of citizens or demands that are placed on them and converting them into law. And the oversight function is the actual keeping an eye on government to make sure it's doing what it should be doing. On a very basic way, that is just making sure illegal activities aren't going on. But on a more day-to-day basis, it's making sure that agencies are doing what Congress asks them to do. Sort of the managerial function, which we often only associate with the president, but agencies also have to worry about oversight from Congress.